I thought I had raised my son Michael to be a compassionate, understanding man. For 35 years, I poured everything I had into being his father. I worked double shifts at the manufacturing plant to pay for his college tuition, sacrificed family vacations to fund his dream wedding to Sarah, and even took out a second mortgage on my house to help him buy his first home. But the day I told him I was getting remarried, 5 years after his mother's death, he looked at me with such disgust and fury that I barely recognized the boy I had raised. His words cut deeper than any physical blow ever could. He called me disgusting, a pathetic old man who couldn't stand being alone. He said I was replacing his mother like she meant nothing, that I was dishonoring everything she had ever meant to our family. What Michael didn't know was that my new wife wasn't some random woman I'd met online or at a bar. She wasn't a gold digger looking for financial security, and she wasn't some lonely widow seeking companionship. She was someone whose story would make him understand that sometimes love comes in the most unexpected and necessary forms. But he never gave me the chance to explain before he stormed out of my life, taking his wife Sarah and my 2 precious grandchildren with him. The silence that followed his departure was deafening. The house that had once been filled with the sounds of family dinners and children's laughter became a tomb of memories and regret. I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about parenthood, about love, about the choices we make in the name of moving forward. But what Michael didn't understand, what he couldn't see past his own grief and anger, was that my decision to remarry wasn't about forgetting his mother or replacing the love we'd shared. It was about honoring her memory by refusing to let my heart die with her. It all started 18 months earlier when I was volunteering at the local community center on Maple Street. I'd been doing volunteer work there every weekend since my wife Helen passed away from breast cancer after a 2-year battle that drained our savings and left me emotionally devastated. The volunteer work gave me purpose during those dark months when getting out of bed felt like an insurmountable challenge. It helped me feel less alone in that big empty house that still echoed with her laughter, still held the faint scent of her perfume in the bedroom closets, still had her reading glasses on the nightstand next to a bookmark marking her place in a novel she would never finish. I was helping serve lunch to families in need on a particularly cold Saturday in February when I noticed a young woman sitting alone in the corner with 2 small children. The community center's dining hall was bustling with activity, volunteers moving between tables with steaming trays of food, children running between chairs while their parents tried to maintain some semblance of order. But this family seemed isolated from the cheerful chaos, sitting quietly at a table near the window where pale winter sunlight filtered through frost-covered glass. She couldn't have been more than 28, but there was something in her eyes that spoke of struggles far beyond her years. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind of careful mending and strategic layering that spoke of someone who took pride in their appearance despite limited resources. She kept her head down as she quietly helped her children eat their meal, cutting up chicken nuggets for the younger child while encouraging the older one to finish his vegetables. The little girl, maybe 5 years old, had beautiful curly hair that caught the light, but wore shoes that were clearly too small, the kind of compromise parents make when children's feet grow faster than budgets allow. The boy, perhaps 7, kept glancing around nervously as if he expected trouble to find them even here in this safe space. Something about the way the mother carefully rationed the food between her children, barely eating anything herself, reminded me painfully of my own struggles as a young father. When Helen and I were first married, fresh out of college with dreams bigger than our bank account, we went through some tough times financially. I remembered the shame of having to swallow my pride and ask for help, the way it felt to sit in rooms like this one, accepting charity while trying to maintain dignity. I remembered Helen's gentle strength during those difficult months, the way she could make a meal of rice and beans feel like a feast, the way she never let me see her cry, even though I knew she sometimes did. I approached their table with what I hoped was a gentle smile, carrying a small bag of homemade chocolate chip cookies that Mrs. Rodriguez, one of our regular volunteers, had made that morning. Mrs. Rodriguez always made extra, claiming she could never get the measurements right, but I suspected she simply couldn't bear the thought of any child leaving hungry. The woman looked up at me with startling green eyes that seemed to hold depths of exhaustion and wariness, the protective instincts of a mother who had learned to be suspicious of strangers offering help. There was intelligence in those eyes, education and breeding that spoke of better circumstances in her past. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but educated, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. She introduced herself as Anna, and her children as Emma and James, speaking their names with the kind of fierce pride that suggested these children were the most precious things in her world. Over the following weeks, I began to look forward to seeing Anna and the children with an anticipation that surprised me. They came in every Saturday for lunch, arriving precisely at noon when the doors opened, always sitting at the same table by the window. Gradually, carefully, Anna began to open up to me during our brief conversations. I learned that she was a registered nurse who had lost her job when the small clinic where she worked was forced to close due to budget cuts and changes in healthcare funding. The clinic had served primarily low-income patients, and when government funding was reduced, it became financially impossible to keep the doors open. Anna had been applying everywhere for work, submitting applications to hospitals, private practices, urgent care centers, nursing homes, anywhere that might need her skills. But most places wanted someone who could work nights and weekends, someone available for the kind of irregular scheduling that healthcare demands. Anna didn't have anyone to watch the kids during those hours. Daycare costs for 2 children would eat up more than she could hope to make, and her family had made it brutally clear they weren't interested in helping. She told me about her family's reaction to her marriage and subsequent struggles with carefully chosen words, but I could read between the lines. They thought she was too young when she married at 22, that she was making a mistake by choosing love over the practical considerations they valued. When her marriage fell apart spectacularly, when her husband abandoned her and the children with nothing but debt and broken promises, her family's response had been variations of, "We told you so." They told her she had made her bed and would have to lie in it, that they had warned her about marrying for love instead of security, that perhaps this experience would teach her to make better choices in the future. The cruelty of turning away from your own daughter in her darkest hour was something I couldn't fathom. My own parents had always been supportive, even when Helen and I struggled in those early years, even when my father disagreed with some of my choices. The idea of watching your child suffer and offering judgment instead of help went against everything I believed about family. Anna and the children were staying at a women's shelter downtown, one of those temporary housing facilities that provide a safe place to sleep but little privacy or stability. They could only keep families for a maximum of 90 days, and Anna's time was running out. After that, she faced the terrifying prospect of homelessness with 2 young children, of trying to navigate the complex web of social services and temporary housing while maintaining the appearance of stability necessary to keep her children in school and out of the foster care system. The desperation in her voice when she talked about their housing situation was carefully controlled, but I could hear it nonetheless. This was a woman who had never expected to find herself in such circumstances, who had done everything right according to the rules she'd been taught, and who was discovering that sometimes life doesn't care about your plans or preparations. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Anna and her children, while winter wind rattled the windows of my too large, too empty house. The house felt especially cavernous in the darkness, filled with shadows and silence that seemed to mock the memories of happier times. I found myself imagining what it would be like to hear children's laughter echoing through the halls again, to have the sounds of a family getting ready for school in the morning, to come home to something other than the hollow echo of my own footsteps. I had more space than I knew what to do with, more rooms than one person could ever need. Helen and I had bought this house when we were young and optimistic, planning for the large family we never ended up having. We dreamed of filling those bedrooms with children, of hosting holiday gatherings that spilled from room to room, of growing old surrounded by grandchildren and the comfortable chaos of a life well lived. Michael had been our only child, not by choice but by circumstance, and now the 4-bedroom house with its big backyard and white picket fence felt like a monument to dreams that had never quite materialized. The guest suite above the garage had its own entrance, bathroom, and small kitchenette. Helen and I had designed it as a place for her aging parents to live independently while still being close to family. They had passed away before ever needing it, and it had sat empty for years, occasionally housing visiting relatives or serving as my home office when I needed to work late. It was completely self-contained, private enough for a family to maintain their dignity while giving them the stability they desperately needed. The next Saturday, I approached Anna with a proposition that had been keeping me awake all week. my heart was racing with nervousness as I asked if we could talk privately after lunch. We sat on a bench in the small garden area behind the community center, where winter bare trees cast intricate shadows on the frozen ground. I could see my breath in the cold air as I carefully explained my offer. I told her about the guest suite, about how it had everything a small family would need, about how it was just sitting empty while they were facing homelessness. I explained that there would be no rent, no strings attached, just a safe place for them and their kids while she got back on her feet. I could see the shock in her eyes, the disbelief that a stranger would offer such generosity without expecting something in return. Anna stared at me in silence for what felt like an eternity, her green eyes searching my face as if trying to read my true intentions. Finally, she asked why I would do this for people I barely knew, what I hoped to gain from such an arrangement. Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the underlying fear of a woman who had learned that offers of help often came with hidden costs. I told her the truth, all of it. I explained that, once upon a time, I was a young father who needed help, and someone was kind enough to give it to me without making me feel like a charity case. I told her about Helen's death, about the suffocating silence of living alone in a house designed for a family, about how volunteer work was the only thing that made me feel useful anymore. And I admitted that hearing children's voices in my home again, knowing that I was making a real difference in their lives, would help me as much as it helped them. The honesty seemed to reach something in Anna that careful diplomacy couldn't touch. Tears filled her eyes as she realized that this wasn't about pity or condescension, but about two different kinds of need finding a way to help each other. She asked for time to think about it, to discuss it with her children, to make sure this was the right choice for all of them. Anna and the children moved in the following week, on a Saturday morning, when the late February sun finally broke through the clouds that had dominated the sky for months. I helped them carry their few possessions up the stairs to the guest suite, struck by how little they had managed to hold on to through all their struggles. A few suitcases of clothes, some toys for the children, a small box of photographs and mementos that represented the remnants of a life that had fallen apart. The change in my daily routine was remarkable and immediate. Instead of waking up to the oppressive silence that had characterized my mornings for the past 5 years, I heard the sounds of a family getting ready for the day. Emma's excited chatter as she got dressed for school, James's more serious voice as he reviewed his homework one final time, Anna's gentle guidance as she helped them prepare breakfast and pack their lunches. The sounds drifted down from the guest suite and filled the main house with a warmth and energy I had forgotten existed. Anna had found part-time work at a nearby clinic, finally getting her foot back in the door of her chosen profession. The pay wasn't enough for her to afford her own place yet, but it was a start, a foundation she could build upon. On the days she worked, I found myself naturally stepping into a grandfather-like role with Emma and James, helping with homework, providing after-school snacks, and generally being present in a way that felt both familiar and completely new. James, I discovered, was fascinated by anything mechanical or technological. When he found out I used to work as an engineer before my retirement, his shy exterior melted away like snow in spring sunshine. He began following me around like a devoted shadow whenever I did repairs around the house, asking endless questions about how things worked, why they were designed the way they were, what would happen if you changed various components. His curiosity was infectious, reminding me of my own childhood fascination with taking things apart to see what made them tick. Emma, meanwhile, had appointed herself as my official baking assistant, a role she took with the utmost seriousness. She would drag a little stool over to the kitchen counter and stand beside me as we measured flour and sugar for cookies, her small hands carefully cracking eggs, while her tongue stuck out in concentration. She had opinions about everything we made, suggesting additional chocolate chips or questioning my choice of vanilla over almond extract. Her enthusiasm for creating something delicious from simple ingredients reminded me of Helen, who had taught me that cooking was an act of love made tangible. One afternoon, as we worked on a batch of snickerdoodles for the community center, Emma looked up at me with those big, serious eyes and asked if I was like their grandpa now. The question caught me completely off guard, hitting me with an emotional force that nearly brought me to my knees. I felt my throat tighten with unexpected tears as I realized that this child, who had known so much instability and disappointment in her young life, was brave enough to hope for permanence, for family, for the kind of unconditional love that grandparents represent. I told her I would be honored if she thought of me that way, and she beamed at me with a smile that could have powered the entire house. Then she threw her flower-covered arms around my waist in a hug that nearly brought me to tears, leaving white handprints on my shirt that I couldn't bear to wash out for weeks. Anna was working hard to rebuild her life, but progress was slow and frustrating. The part-time position didn't pay enough for her to afford her own place, not in a market where even modest apartments required security deposits and first and last month's rent up front. Every time she thought she'd found something better, a full-time position or a better-paying opportunity, it would fall through at the last minute. Budget cuts, hiring freezes, or the simple reality that there were more qualified candidates than available positions. Meanwhile, the children were thriving in ways that were beautiful to witness. James had joined the local Little League team, his natural athleticism and competitive spirit finding an outlet in baseball. I attended every game, cheering from the bleachers alongside other parents and grandparents, feeling my heart swell with pride every time he made a good play or showed good sportsmanship. Emma was taking dance classes at the community center, her natural grace and rhythm blossoming under the guidance of the patient instructors. I watched her recitals from the front row, recording every performance on my phone like the doting grandfather I had never expected to become again. For the first time in months, they were acting like normal, happy children instead of two little people carrying the weight of adult worries. They had chores and bedtimes and rules about homework before television. They had friends they could invite over, birthday parties they could attend, the luxury of childhood that should never be extraordinary but too often is. As for me, I was happier than I'd been since Helen's death. Having purpose again, having people to care for and worry about, had awakened something in me that I thought had died with my wife. I found myself looking forward to each day instead of just enduring it, planning activities and outings, thinking about the future in terms of possibility rather than mere survival. It was during this time of unexpected contentment that Michael started making comments about my changed attitude. He noticed that I seemed different during our weekly phone calls and monthly family dinners, more energetic and engaged than I'd been in years. He asked if I was seeing someone, if I'd found a hobby or joined a club, what was responsible for this apparent transformation. I should have told him about Anna and the children then. Should have been honest about how they'd brought life back into my house and purpose back into my days. But something in his tone, a slight edge of suspicion and disapproval, made me hesitate. Michael had always been protective of his mother's memory, sometimes to an almost unhealthy degree. In the 5 years since Helen's death, he'd made several pointed comments about how I should honor her memory and not dishonor what they had by moving on too quickly. He seemed to believe that prolonged grief was somehow more respectful than healing, that finding happiness again would diminish what Helen and I had shared. So instead of honesty, I gave him vague answers about staying busy with volunteer work and home improvement projects. I told him I was taking better care of myself, eating more regularly, getting more exercise, maintaining the house the way Helen would have wanted. It wasn't technically lying, but it wasn't the whole truth either. And I could see him filing away my evasive answers for future consideration. Sarah, always more perceptive than my son, noticed changes during their visits that Michael missed entirely. She commented on the children's drawings that had appeared on my refrigerator, the toys that occasionally forgot to get put away before they arrived, the gradual transformation of my house from a sterile monument to the past into something that looked actually lived in again. When she asked about the drawings, I explained them away as artwork from kids at the community center, children who liked to give their volunteer helpers little gifts. When she noticed a child's jacket hanging in my coat closet, I said I'd been helping transport some families and must have forgotten to return it. Each small deception felt like a betrayal of the truth I was afraid to tell, but I convinced myself I was protecting everyone involved until I could find the right time and way to explain. As months passed, what had started as a temporary housing arrangement began to feel like something much more permanent and meaningful. Anna had become not just a tenant, but a friend, and then gradually something deeper and more complex. We talked for hours in the evenings after the children were in bed, sharing stories about our pasts, our dreams, our fears for the future. We sat on the front porch during warm summer evenings, watching Emma and James play in the yard, while we discussed everything from politics to philosophy to the small daily details that make up a life. She told me about growing up in Romania during the final years of communism, about the fear and uncertainty that colored her childhood, about immigrating to the United States with her family when she was 15. She described the challenges of learning a new language while trying to maintain her sense of cultural identity, of adapting to American customs while honoring her heritage, of trying to balance gratitude for opportunities with grief for everything left behind. She talked about meeting her ex-husband in nursing school, about how charming and attentive he'd been during their courtship, how he'd seemed to share her dreams of building a stable family life. She described the gradual transformation from romance to control, the way he'd slowly isolated her from friends and family, the escalating emotional abuse that had worn down her self-confidence and independence. The final abandonment, she explained, had almost been a relief compared to the constant tension of walking on eggshells in her own home. I shared stories about Helen that I hadn't told anyone since her death, memories that had felt too precious and fragile to speak aloud. I told Anna about our early years of marriage, about the financial struggles and small victories that had bonded us together. I described Helen's battle with cancer, the way she'd faced her diagnosis with courage and humor, even when the treatments left her weak and sick. I talked about the guilt I still carried, wondering if I could have done more, been stronger, somehow changed the outcome through sheer force of will. Anna listened to these stories with the kind of deep attention that heals old wounds, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that help me see familiar memories from new angles. She never tried to minimize my grief or rush me past it, but she helped me understand that loving Helen completely didn't require staying frozen in the moment of losing her. We discovered we both loved old movies, particularly the romantic comedies of the 1940s and 50s that portrayed love as both passionate and enduring. We shared a weakness for terrible jokes, the kind of wordplay that makes children groan and adults laugh despite themselves. We both found comfort in the ritual of baking, the way measuring and mixing could occupy your hands while your mind worked through complex emotions. The children had long since stopped referring to me as Mr. David and had begun calling me Grandpa David, much to their mother's embarrassment and my secret delight. I attended James's baseball games and Emma's dance recitals, cheering louder than any biological grandfather could have. I helped with homework and art projects, taught James how to change a tire, and showed Emma how to plant a garden. I was present for scraped knees and hurt feelings, for small triumphs and daily disappointments. It was after Emma's spring recital, as we sat in the kitchen sharing leftover cake and reliving her performance, that Anna looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. There was something different in her eyes, a vulnerability and hope that made my heart skip a beat. She asked if what we had become was more than just me helping a family in need, if the feelings growing between us were something I acknowledged and returned. I told her yes, it had become much more than temporary assistance. Somewhere along the way, without either of us planning or expecting it, we had become a family in all the ways that truly mattered. I had fallen in love not just with her, but with the life we were building together, with the daily rhythms of caring for each other, with the way Emma and James had filled the empty spaces in my heart that I'd thought would always ache. Anna confessed that she had fallen in love with me too, not out of gratitude or financial necessity, but because I had shown her and her children what genuine kindness looked like, what stability and unconditional love could feel like. She said I was the most genuinely good man she'd ever met, someone who had given freely without expecting anything in return, who had treated her children as if they were precious gifts rather than burdens to be endured. But even as we acknowledged our feelings for each other, we both understood the complications that lay ahead. There was my son to consider, his likely reaction to learning about our relationship. There was the difference in our ages, the questions and assumptions people would make about our motivations. There was the challenge of blending a family, of helping the children navigate the transition from temporary arrangement to permanent commitment. 3 months later, on a quiet Tuesday evening in early autumn, I asked Anna to marry me, not with a grand gesture or an expensive ring, but simply and honestly in the kitchen where we'd shared so many conversations, while Emma and James slept upstairs in what had become their permanent bedrooms. I told her I knew it might seem fast, but at my age, I'd learned not to waste time when you find something precious and real. I asked her to let me be a real father to Emma and James, to help me fill this house with the family it was always meant to hold. I promised to love them all with everything I had, to provide stability and security, to be present for all the moments big and small that make up a childhood. Through her tears, she said yes, and we held each other in that quiet kitchen, while our children slept peacefully upstairs, unaware that their world was about to become even more secure and permanent. We planned a small ceremony for the following month, just the four of us and a few close friends from the community center. I knew I would have to tell Michael, and I spent weeks rehearsing what I would say, how I would explain that this wasn't about replacing his mother, but about choosing not to spend the rest of my life alone. I practiced different approaches, different ways of framing the situation that might help him understand that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, that my capacity to care for Anna and her children didn't reduce what I'd felt for Helen or what I felt for him. I called him on a Tuesday evening in the late October, asking if he and Sarah could come over for dinner on Friday. I said I had some news to share, hoping it would be received as the good news I believed it to be. Michael seemed pleased by the invitation, mentioning that Tyler and Grace had been asking when they could see Grandpa again, that it had been too long since we'd all been together. That Friday, Anna took the children to her friend's house for a sleepover, giving me the privacy I needed for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. I spent the afternoon cooking Michael's favorite meal, preparing the pot roast and mashed potatoes that had been his request for every birthday dinner since childhood. I set the table with Helen's good china, the wedding pattern we'd chosen together 40 years earlier, trying to create an atmosphere of celebration and family continuity. When Michael and Sarah arrived with my grandchildren, 8-year-old Tyler and 5-year-old Grace, I hugged them all tightly, breathing in the scent of their hair and holding them a moment longer than usual. Some part of me sensed that this might be the last peaceful family dinner we'd have for a while, that the news I was about to share would change everything between us in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. Over dinner, we talked about work and school, Tyler's progress in soccer, and Grace's new fascination with dinosaurs. Michael seemed relaxed and happy, telling funny stories about his coworkers and asking about my volunteer activities. Sarah shared news about her book club and her plans to redecorate their living room. The conversation flowed easily, filled with the comfortable rhythms of family interaction that I had missed more than I'd realized. After we'd finished eating and the children were playing in the living room with toys I kept specifically for their visits, I took a deep breath and began the conversation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I asked Michael and Sarah to stay seated, telling them I had something important to share that would affect all of our lives. I started by explaining how volunteer work had helped me cope with grief and loneliness after Helen's death. I described meeting Anna and her children at the community center, the desperate circumstances that had led me to offer them housing, the way their presence had gradually transformed my daily existence from mere survival into something approaching joy again. I watched Michael's face carefully as I spoke, seeing the subtle changes in expression that told me he was beginning to understand where this conversation was heading. His relaxed posture stiffened, his smile faded, and something cold and hard entered his eyes. But I pressed on, determined to tell the complete story before he could interrupt with judgments or accusations. I explained how Anna and I had developed feelings for each other over time, how what had started as a practical arrangement had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful. I told them about Emma and James, about their intelligence and resilience, about how they'd brought laughter and purpose back into my life. And finally, I told them that Anna had agreed to marry me, that we were planning a small ceremony in the coming weeks. The silence that followed was deafening and seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah looked shocked, but not necessarily displeased, her expression cycling through surprise, concern, and what might have been cautious approval. Michael, however, looked like I'd just announced my intention to burn down everything he held sacred. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous, carrying an undertone of barely controlled rage that I'd rarely heard from him, even during his most difficult teenage years. He asked if I was kidding him, if this was some kind of elaborate joke, if I had completely lost my mind in my old age. I tried to explain that Anna wasn't replacing his mother, that no one could ever do that what Helen and I had shared remained precious and irreplaceable. I reminded him that I was 62 years old and could potentially have 20 or 30 more years ahead of me. Did he really want me to spend them alone, isolated, gradually becoming one of those elderly widowers who slowly fade away from lack of human connection? Michael's response was immediate and explosive. He slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the dishes jump, shouting that if that's what it took to honor Mom's memory, then yes, absolutely yes. He reminded me of the vows I'd made to his mother, the promise to love her until death parted us. He said that, "Till death do us part" didn't mean, "Till death do us part," and then you move on to the next woman who shows you attention. When I mentioned that Emma and James were wonderful children who had been through a lot, children I'd grown to love as if they were my own grandchildren, Michael became even more enraged. His voice rose to a level that made me worry about Tyler and Grace hearing him from the next room. He said Emma and James weren't my grandchildren, that Tyler and Grace were my grandchildren, that these were some stranger's kids I was using to fill a pathetic void in my life. The argument escalated from there, with Michael's anger feeding on itself, until he was saying things I never thought I'd hear from the son I'd raised to be compassionate and fair-minded. He called my decision disgusting and disrespectful, a betrayal of everything his mother had meant to our family. When I tried to defend Anna's character and background, he dismissed her as a gold-digging immigrant who probably didn't even love me, who was just looking for financial security and citizenship status. The racism in his words hit me like a physical blow, revealing an ugly side of my son that I'd never seen before. I realized that grief and anger had twisted him into someone I barely recognized, someone whose pain had transformed into cruelty toward people who had done nothing to deserve it. I lost my temper then, something I rarely did but couldn't control in the face of such deliberate unfairness. I told him I was done letting him dictate how I was allowed to grieve, how I was allowed to heal, how I was allowed to live the remainder of my life. I explained that his mother was the love of my youth, but that didn't mean I was required to spend the rest of my days as a monument to her memory, slowly deteriorating in isolation as some kind of tribute to what we'd shared. Michael's final ultimatum was delivered with the cold precision of someone who had moved beyond anger into something much more calculated and final. He said that if I married Anna, we were done completely. He meant it with every fiber of his being. He wouldn't have his children around what he called a perversion of what a family should be. He wouldn't pretend to be happy about me replacing their grandmother with some foreign woman who didn't understand our values or our history. He told me to get out of the house I'd shared with Mom and go play house with my new family, but to never contact him again. No calls, no visits, no cards or gifts for holidays or birthdays. As far as he was concerned, I was no longer his father, and he was no longer my son. When Sarah tried to intervene, pointing out that he was speaking in anger and might regret such extreme statements later, Michael gathered up Tyler and Grace with grim determination. Both children looked confused and frightened by the sudden change in atmosphere, by their father's obvious rage and their grandfather's obvious distress. Grace asked why Daddy was mad at Grandpa, her little voice trembling with confusion and fear. Michael told her it was because Grandpa had forgotten what family means, that sometimes people change in ways that make it impossible to love them anymore. The cruelty of saying such things in front of a 5-year-old child, of using her innocent question as an opportunity to wound me further, revealed just how far my son had fallen from the values I'd tried to instill in him. Then he walked out of my house with my grandchildren, slamming the front door behind him with such force that a framed photograph of Helen fell off the mantel and shattered on the hardwood floor. The sound of breaking glass seemed to echo through the empty rooms long after their car had disappeared down the street, leaving me standing alone in the wreckage of what I'd hoped would be a celebration. When Anna came home later that evening and found me sitting in the dark living room, still surrounded by the remnants of our interrupted dinner, she took one look at my face and knew exactly what had happened. She sat beside me on the couch and held my hand while I told her about Michael's reaction, about his ultimatum, about the ugly things he'd said about her and the children. Anna's response was immediate and selfless. She offered to reconsider everything, to take Emma and James and find another way to rebuild their lives that wouldn't cost me my relationship with my son. She said she couldn't be the reason I lost my family, that my connection to Michael and my grandchildren was more important than our feelings for each other. But I told her firmly that she and Emma and James were my family now too, that I wouldn't let fear or guilt dictate how I lived the rest of my life. We were getting married as planned, and if Michael eventually came around, that would be wonderful. If he didn't, that was his choice to make. But I wouldn't abandon the people who needed me in order to appease someone who was demanding I choose between love and loneliness. We were married 3 weeks later, in a small ceremony at the community center where we'd first met. Anna wore a simple white dress that made her look radiant, and Emma and James stood beside us as our wedding party, beaming with joy at the official confirmation that we were a real family now. Mrs. Rodriguez made our wedding cake, the same woman who'd been making cookies for community center children for over a decade. The volunteers who had become our chosen family filled the small chapel with love and support, celebrating with us even though they knew the complicated circumstances that had led to this moment. It was one of the happiest days of my life, watching Anna become my wife while Emma and James became my children in every way except biology. But it was also tinged with profound sadness because my son and his family weren't there to share it with us, because the people who should have been most important to this milestone had chosen to exclude themselves from our joy. The months that followed were both the best and worst of my life in equal measure. Anna and I settled into married life with surprising ease, finding that the months of living together had prepared us well for the daily negotiations and compromises that marriage requires. She had officially taken my last name, and I had begun the legal process of adopting Emma and James, making our family unit official in the eyes of the law as well as in our hearts. The children thrived in the security of knowing this was their permanent home, their permanent family, that they would never again face the uncertainty of temporary housing or conditional acceptance. Emma started calling me Daddy David, a title that never failed to make my heart soar with pride and love. James had joined the robotics club at school and insisted on showing me every project, explaining each component with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me of Michael at that age, back when we shared easy conversations about engineering and problem solving. I had officially adopted both children, and they had taken my last name with pride. When people asked about my kids, I talked about Emma and James with the same parental pride I'd once felt talking about Michael. They were my children in every way that mattered, and I was their father in all the ways that counted. But the silence from my son was deafening and heartbreaking. Not a day went by that I didn't think about Michael, Tyler, and Grace, wondering how they were doing, whether the children missed me, if Michael ever regretted the harsh words that had driven us apart. I tried calling several times in those first few months, but he never answered. The phone would ring and ring before going to voicemail, and not a day went by that I didn't think about Michael, Tyler, and Grace, wondering how they were doing, whether the children missed me, if Michael ever regretted the harsh words that had driven us apart. I tried calling several times in those first few months, but he never answered. The phone would ring and ring before going to voicemail, and I would hang up without leaving a message, knowing that anything I said would only make things worse. I sent birthday cards to Tyler and Grace, carefully choosing ones that weren't too sentimental, but still expressed my love for them. I never received any acknowledgement that they'd been received, never got a thank you call or even a simple text message confirming they had arrived. It was as if 35 years of being Michael's father, 8 years of being Tyler's grandfather, 5 years of being Grace's grandfather, had been completely erased by his anger and pride. I drove by their house, sometimes during my weekly errands, hoping to catch a glimpse of my biological grandchildren playing in the yard or coming home from school. I never stopped, never got out of the car, never tried to approach them directly. Michael had made his position crystal clear, and I had to respect that boundary even though it was slowly killing me inside. But I couldn't help hoping that maybe I'd see them, that maybe one of them would wave if they spotted my car, that maybe there was still some connection that Michael's anger couldn't completely sever. Sarah called me once, about 3 months after the wedding, when Anna was at work and the children were at school. Her voice was careful and measured, but I could hear the emotion underneath her controlled tone. She said she thought what I was doing was wonderful, that from what little she'd seen of Anna, she seemed like a lovely person who clearly cared about me and the children. If Anna made me happy, then Sarah was happy for me too. She told me things that broke my heart and gave me hope in equal measure. Tyler and Grace missed me terribly, she said. Tyler kept asking when he could see Grandpa again, whether I was mad at him, if he'd done something wrong to make me go away. Grace was having nightmares, waking up crying and asking for me in the middle of the night. She didn't understand why Daddy was angry with me, why our family had suddenly become smaller and sadder. Sarah was worried about Michael too, she confided. He'd been drinking more than usual, not to the point of having a serious problem, but enough to be noticeable. He'd been picking fights with everyone at work, getting into arguments with his boss and coworkers over trivial matters that he would normally let slide. His anger seemed to be eating him alive from the inside, poisoning his relationships and his peace of mind. She asked if there was anything I could do to repair the relationship, if I would consider reaching out one more time, or perhaps writing a letter that might get through to him when phone calls couldn't. but I told her honestly that the ball was in Michael's court now. I'd tried to explain my position, I'd offered compromises and understanding, but he'd made it clear that my marriage to Anna was an unforgivable betrayal in his eyes. Until he was ready to accept that I had the right to build a new life, there was nothing more I could do without making the situation worse. A year passed, then 2. Anna and I celebrated our second wedding anniversary with a small party in our backyard, surrounded by Emma's and James's friends from school, Anna's co-workers from the clinic where she now worked full-time, and our chosen family from the community center. The house was filled with laughter and music, with the sounds of children playing and adults enjoying each other's company. It was the kind of gathering Helen and I had dreamed of hosting when we first bought the house, the kind of celebration that transforms a building into a true home. Emma, now 9, had become an accomplished little dancer and was preparing to audition for the advanced class at her dance studio. She'd grown more confident and outgoing over the past 2 years, secure in the knowledge that she had a stable home and family who would always be there to support her dreams. James, now 11, had been accepted into a gifted program at school and spent most of his free time building increasingly complex robots and machines. His bedroom looked like a mad scientist's laboratory, filled with circuits and motors and half-finished inventions that demonstrated both his creativity and his analytical mind. Watching them grow and thrive was one of the greatest joys of my life, proof that love and stability could heal even the deepest wounds. Anna had been promoted to head nurse at her clinic, recognition of both her medical skills and her natural leadership abilities. She'd completed additional training in pediatric care and was considering going back to school for a master's degree in nursing administration. Her confidence had returned along with her financial stability, and she'd blossomed into the strong, independent woman she'd always been, underneath the fear and desperation of those early days. As for our marriage, it had exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. We'd learned to navigate the complexities of blending a family, of helping the children adjust to having a stepfather while maintaining their sense of identity and connection to their biological father's memory. Anna and I had developed the kind of partnership that comes from shared challenges and mutual respect, supporting each other through difficult times and celebrating each other's successes. But despite all the happiness and fulfillment in my new life, not a day went by that I didn't think about Michael, Tyler, and Grace. The ache of their absence was a constant low-level pain, like an old injury that never quite heals completely. I wondered if Tyler was still playing soccer, if Grace had overcome her fear of dinosaurs, or developed new obsessions. I wondered if they still asked about me, if they understood why I was no longer part of their lives, if they would even remember me when they grew older. The hardest moments were the holidays and special occasions when the absence of my first family felt most acute. Christmas mornings when Emma and James opened their gifts with excitement while I thought about Tyler and Grace doing the same thing across town without me. Father's Day when I received handmade cards from my adopted children while wondering if my biological grandchildren even knew what day it was. Birthday celebrations that felt incomplete because half of my family was missing by choice rather than circumstance. I tried to hide these moments of sadness from Anna and the children, not wanting to diminish their joy or make them feel like they weren't enough to complete my happiness. But Anna, with her nurse's instincts and her deep understanding of human nature, always seemed to know when I was struggling with grief over my lost relationship with Michael. She never pushed me to talk about it when I wasn't ready, but she was always there with a gentle touch or a knowing look that reminded me I wasn't alone in my pain. It was on a rainy Tuesday evening in late October, exactly 2 years and 1 month after that terrible dinner, when Michael had walked out of my life, when everything changed. Anna was in the kitchen helping Emma with her math homework, while James and I worked on his latest robotics project at the dining room table. The rain was drumming against the windows, creating a cozy atmosphere that made our warm, well-lit home feel like a sanctuary against the cold darkness outside. When the doorbell rang, I assumed it was a delivery driver, or perhaps one of the neighbors looking to borrow something or drop off mail that had been delivered to the wrong address. I set down the tiny screwdriver I'd been using to help James attach a sensor to his robot and made my way to the front door, expecting a brief, routine interaction. Instead, I found myself face to face with my son Michael for the first time in over 2 years. The shock of seeing him was so complete that for a moment I wondered if I was hallucinating, If grief and longing had finally driven me to imagine the reunion I'd dreamed about, but never expected to happen. He looked terrible, and I don't say that with any satisfaction or vindictiveness. He'd lost a significant amount of weight. His normally well-groomed hair was disheveled and too long, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and ongoing stress. His clothes were wrinkled and slightly too large, as if he'd been losing weight faster than he could adjust his wardrobe. But what struck me most was the expression on his face, the complete absence of the anger and hatred I'd last seen. Instead, he looked broken, desperate, and somehow younger than his 37 years, like a lost child who had finally found his way home. He spoke my name like a question, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to call me Dad anymore after everything that had passed between us. His voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse with emotion and uncertainty. He said he needed to talk to me, that he'd been driving around the neighborhood for hours trying to work up the courage to knock on my door. For a moment, I couldn't speak. 2 years of imagined conversations, of things I'd wanted to say and questions I'd wanted to ask, all crowded into my throat at once. Then my parental instincts kicked in, the same protective love that had guided me through Michael's childhood scrapes and teenage crises. Whatever had happened between us, whatever harsh words had been spoken, this was still my son standing on my doorstep in obvious distress. I stepped aside and gestured for him to come in, my voice thick with emotion, as I told him of course he could come in, that he was always welcome in my home no matter what had passed between us. Michael stepped into the entryway, and I could see him taking in the changes to the house with obvious surprise and something that might have been regret. The walls that had once displayed only formal family portraits and wedding photos now held a mixture of old memories and new ones. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator in a riot of color and creativity. James's soccer cleats sat by the door next to a small pair of dance shoes. Anna's nursing textbooks were stacked on the hall table next to my reading glasses and a coffee mug that said "World's Best Dad" in Emma's careful handwriting. The house that had once been a quiet monument to the past was now clearly the bustling home of an active, happy family. There were signs of life everywhere, a sweater draped over a chair, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle on the coffee table, the lingering smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen. It looked like what it was, a place where people who loved each other lived and laughed and built memories together. Anna appeared from the kitchen when she heard voices, stopping short when she saw Michael. For a moment, the three of us stood in awkward silence, the weight of history and hurt feelings hanging heavy in the air. I could see Anna taking in Michael's appearance with the clinical eye of a healthcare professional, noting the signs of stress and exhaustion that were written clearly on his face and posture. I introduced them formally, my voice careful and neutral, as I said Michael's name and then Anna's. Anna stepped forward with the same warm smile she gave to nervous patients at the clinic, extending her hand in a gesture of welcome that was both gracious and brave considering the terrible things Michael had said about her. Michael looked at her outstretched hand for what felt like an eternity, and I held my breath waiting to see if he would reject this basic gesture of civility. Finally, slowly, he reached out and shook her hand briefly, his voice stiff but not openly hostile as he returned her greeting. Emma appeared at Anna's side like a curious kitten, drawn by the sound of new voices and the obvious tension in the room. She looked up at Michael with those big, serious eyes that missed nothing, taking in his obvious distress with the kind of straightforward concern that children possess before they learn to hide their feelings behind social conventions. Anna gently explained that this was Daddy David's son, Michael, then suggested that Emma go help James clean up his project so the grown-ups could talk privately. Emma nodded solemnly and disappeared back toward the dining room, and I could hear her whispering to James, followed by the sound of robot parts being carefully packed away. Anna offered coffee with the kind of genuine hospitality that came naturally to her, but Michael shook his head and said he couldn't stay long, that he just needed to talk to me alone. Anna nodded gracefully and excused herself to the kitchen, but not before telling Michael she was sorry to see him looking so troubled, and that if there was anything our family could do to help, he only needed to ask. After Anna left, Michael and I stood there for a moment, 2 years of silence and hurt, hanging between us like a wall neither of us knew how to breach. Finally, I suggested we sit down in the living room, and we made our way to the same couch where I'd once read him bedtime stories, and where we'd watched countless baseball games together during his childhood. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the physical distance reflecting the emotional chasm that had opened between us. I could see Michael struggling with where to begin, how to bridge the gap his anger had created, how to apologize for things that couldn't easily be taken back. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion and barely controlled tears. He said he didn't know how to do this, didn't know how to apologize for what he'd said and done, didn't know how to make up for the time we'd lost and the pain he'd caused. I asked him to start by telling me what had brought him to my door on this rainy night, what had finally broken through the wall of pride and anger that had kept us apart for over 2 years. The question seemed to release something in him, and suddenly the words came pouring out in a rush of anguish and regret. He told me that Grace was in the hospital, that she'd been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 3 months earlier. The words hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and sending shockwaves through my entire body. My little granddaughter, my sweet Grace with her infectious giggle and boundless curiosity, was fighting for her life while I'd been shut out, unable to offer support or comfort during the most terrifying experience a family could face. Michael's voice broke as he described the past 3 months of treatments and tests, of watching his vibrant little girl endure chemotherapy that made her sick and tired, that stole her beautiful hair and left her pale and fragile. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic, he said, but it would be a long road. Months more of treatment, possibly years of monitoring, the constant fear that the cancer might return, or that the treatments might not be enough. But what was killing him, what had finally driven him to swallow his pride and come to me, was Grace's constant questions about where I was. She kept asking for her grandpa David, wondering why I didn't visit anymore, why I hadn't come to see her in the hospital, like all her other relatives and family friends. Michael had been forced to tell her over and over that we weren't speaking, that Daddy and Grandpa had had a fight and weren't talking anymore. She didn't understand why adults would let a fight keep them apart when she was sick and scared and needed all the people who loved her. Her innocent questions had forced Michael to confront the reality of what his ultimatum had cost, not just me and him, but his own children who had lost their grandfather because of his inability to accept my choices. Tyler had figured out that the estrangement was Michael's fault, that his father's anger was responsible for my absence from their lives. The boy had become increasingly resentful and distant, barely speaking to Michael and openly expressing his wish that things could go back to the way they were before. At 12 years old, Tyler was old enough to understand that his father had chosen pride over family, and he wasn't shy about expressing his disappointment and anger. Michael broke down completely then, sobbing in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child, afraid of monsters under his bed. He said he'd been such an idiot, that he'd been angry for so long he'd forgotten why he was angry in the first place. When his mother died, he explained, he'd felt like I was all he had left of her. And when I started moving on and building a new life, it felt like I was taking even that away from him. He'd convinced himself that if I could love someone else, then what I'd had with his mother wasn't as special as he'd believed. It felt like I was saying Helen was replaceable, that our marriage and family had been just a practice round for something better. The logic was flawed and cruel, but grief doesn't follow the rules of reason, and fear makes people do terrible things to the people they love most. I told him gently that his mother would always be part of him, that nothing I did could change that fundamental truth. Michael nodded through his tears, saying he understood that now, but at the time, his pain had made him irrational and destructive. Sarah had tried to tell him the same thing, but he'd been too stubborn and angry to listen to wisdom that challenged his narrative of betrayal and abandonment. He said he could see now how wrong he'd been, not just about Anna, but about the whole concept of what family means and how love works. Watching his daughter fight for her life had clarified his priorities in ways that all the arguments and explanations in the world couldn't. Nothing mattered except having the people you love close enough to hold on to, close enough to support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. I moved to his side of the couch and pulled him into a hug, the same way I'd comforted him through childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreaks. For a moment he stiffened, surprised by the physical contact after so much distance and hostility. But then he melted against me, crying into my shoulder like the scared little boy he'd once been, apologizing over and over for the cruel things he'd said and the time we'd lost. I held him and let him cry, feeling my own tears fall as I grieved for Grace's illness, for the months of fear and struggle they'd endured without me, for the relationships that had been damaged by pride and misunderstanding. but I also felt hope blooming in my chest for the first time in 2 years. Hope that we might be able to rebuild what had been broken, that our family might become whole again. When Michael finally composed himself enough to speak, he asked if I would come see Grace at the hospital. She'd been asking for me every day, he said, and the doctors had mentioned that emotional support and familiar faces could be important factors in a child's recovery. He thought maybe seeing me might help her fight harder, might give her the boost of love and encouragement she needed to get through the difficult treatments ahead. I told him I would come immediately if the hospital would allow it, that nothing in the world could keep me away from Grace when she needed me. The relief in Michael's eyes was profound and heartbreaking, as if he'd been afraid I might refuse, might let his past behavior affect my love for his children. Then Michael said something that surprised me. He said he wanted to meet my family, really meet them this time, if they would have him. He wanted to apologize to Anna for the terrible things he'd said, to get to know Emma and James as the people they actually were, rather than the threats he'd imagined them to be. He'd realized that they weren't my replacement family, but an addition to our family, and there was room for everyone if people were willing to open their hearts. That's when Emma appeared in the doorway again, drawn by the sound of adult voices and the obvious emotion in the room. She asked if everything was okay because she could see that Michael was crying, her voice full of the kind of innocent concern that cuts straight through adult pretenses and complications. I explained that this was my son Michael and that he was going through a very difficult time, that sometimes grown-ups cry when they're sad or scared, just like children do. Emma nodded with the serious understanding of a child who had experienced her own share of difficult times and understood that sadness was part of life. Then, without any hesitation or prompting, Emma walked over to Michael and climbed up onto the couch beside him. She told him that hugs help when you're worried, that her daddy David had taught her that, and she wrapped her small arms around him in a gesture of pure, uncomplicated compassion. Michael looked absolutely stunned, as this little girl he'd never met, this child he'd dismissed and resented without knowing anything about her, offered him comfort with complete trust and generosity. I could see the exact moment when his heart broke open, when he realized what I'd been trying to tell him about the capacity for love to grow rather than diminish, about how caring for new people doesn't reduce your ability to love the people you've always cherished. James approached more cautiously, but with equal sincerity and kindness. He'd heard enough of our conversation to understand that Michael's daughter was sick and in the hospital, and he offered to share some of his books and handheld games with her. He explained that his friend Alex had been in the hospital the previous year, and had said the worst part wasn't the medical procedures, but the boredom of lying in bed with nothing interesting to do. Michael looked at this boy who was offering to share his possessions with a stranger's child, who was thinking about Grace's comfort and entertainment rather than protecting his own interests. I could see the shame in Michael's eyes as he realized how wrong he'd been about Anna and the children, how his prejudice and anger had blinded him to their genuine goodness and generous hearts. Anna had been watching from the kitchen doorway, and she approached slowly when she saw that the initial tension had broken. She told Michael she was truly sorry to hear about Grace's illness, that as both a nurse and a mother, she understood how terrifying it must be to watch your child suffer. She said that if there was anything our family could do to help, rides to the hospital, meals, childcare for Tyler, someone to talk to who understood medical procedures, he only needed to ask. Her voice was gentle and completely free of any resentment or vindictiveness, despite the horrible things Michael had said about her character and motivations. She was offering professional expertise and personal support to someone who had treated her cruelly, demonstrating the kind of grace and forgiveness that revealed her true character more clearly than any defense or argument could have. Michael looked up at this woman he'd called terrible names, who was now offering to help his sick daughter without any conditions or expectations of gratitude. The tears started flowing again as he realized the depth of his misjudgment, the way his pain had transformed him into someone capable of cruelty toward innocent people who had only tried to love and care for me. He apologized to Anna directly, his voice thick with shame and regret. He said he'd been wrong about everything, that he could see now why I loved her and the children, that his grief and fear had made him say unforgivable things to someone who didn't deserve his anger. Anna accepted his apology with the same grace she'd shown throughout the encounter, telling him that she understood he'd been in pain and that families sometimes hurt each other when they're scared of losing what matters most. Anna sat down on the coffee table in front of Michael, close enough to take his hands in hers while she spoke. She told him that family wasn't about blood or biology or legal definitions, but about love and choice and showing up for each other when times were difficult. She said that Grace and Tyler were part of our family because they were part of me, and that meant Emma and James considered them family too, whether they'd ever met or not. The simple truth of her words seemed to reach something deep inside Michael that all my arguments and explanations had failed to touch. He asked if Anna thought Grace would like Emma and James, if they might be able to visit her and help her feel less alone during her treatments. Anna smiled warmly and said that Grace was about to discover she had 2 new cousins who couldn't wait to meet her and help her feel better in whatever ways they could. That night, we all went to the hospital together, our blended family united for the first time in a common purpose. Sarah was there when we arrived, and her face lit up with joy and relief when she saw me. She hugged me tightly, whispering that she'd missed me so much and had prayed that somehow we'd all find our way back to each other. She thanked Anna repeatedly for encouraging me to come, for understanding how important this reunion was for all of us. Tyler was asleep in a chair next to Grace's hospital bed, but he woke up when we came into the room. The moment he saw me, he launched himself into my arms with the kind of desperate affection that comes from missing someone too much for too long. He sobbed against my chest, telling me how much he'd missed me, asking if I was mad at him, if he'd done something wrong to make me go away. I held him tight and assured him that he'd done nothing wrong, that the problems between his father and me had nothing to do with him, that I'd missed him every single day we'd been apart. Grace was awake despite the late hour, alert and curious about the sudden influx of visitors. When she saw me, her whole face transformed with joy that was almost too bright for her pale, thin features. The chemotherapy had taken her beautiful hair and left her looking fragile and ethereal, but her spirit was still vibrant and strong. She was wearing a colorful scarf wrapped around her head like a turban, and her eyes were as bright and intelligent as ever. Emma and James hung back at first, overwhelmed by the hospital setting and the obvious emotion of the reunion. But Grace was immediately curious about these new children, and Anna gently introduced them as her children, Grace's new cousins, who had been wanting to meet her for a very long time. Emma, never one to be shy for long, approached Grace's bed and complimented her on the beautiful scarf she was wearing. Grace touched it self-consciously and explained that her hair had fallen out from the medicine that was supposed to make her better. Emma nodded seriously and said that she thought Grace looked beautiful anyway, like a princess wearing a magical crown that would help her defeat the dragon that was trying to hurt her. The metaphor delighted Grace, who had always loved fairy tales and fantasy stories. She asked Emma if she thought the dragon was very big and scary, and Emma considered this gravely before deciding that it was probably medium-sized and definitely more scared of Grace than Grace was of it. This led to an elaborate discussion of dragon fighting strategies that had both girls giggling despite the serious circumstances. James, true to his word, had brought a bag containing several of his favorite books and a handheld electronic game that he'd saved up to buy with his allowance money. He shyly offered them to Grace, explaining that they might help her pass the time between treatments and procedures. He also promised to bring more books next time, including some about robots and inventions that he thought she might find interesting. Grace accepted these gifts with the wonder of a child who wasn't used to receiving presents from people she'd just met. She looked up at her father with questioning eyes, and Michael nodded encouragingly, his own eyes bright with tears as he watched his daughter connect with the children he'd refused to acknowledge as family. As the evening progressed, something beautiful and healing began to happen. The children naturally formed their own group, with Tyler and Grace asking Emma and James about their school, their hobbies, their house, their new life as part of our extended family. Emma told Grace about her dance classes and promised to perform for her when she was feeling better. James explained his robotics projects in detail and offered to teach Tyler how to build a simple robot when Grace was discharged from the hospital. The easy acceptance and instant bond between the children highlighted how artificial and destructive the barriers between us had been. These were cousins meeting for the first time, excited to discover new family members and share their interests and experiences. There was no awkwardness or resentment, no sense that they were being forced together by adult obligations. They simply clicked in the way children do when they recognize kindred spirits. Michael pulled me aside at one point during the visit and apologized again, but this time more specifically and thoughtfully. He said he could see now how wrong he'd been, Not just about Anna, but about the entire concept of what constitutes a family. Watching his children connect with Emma and James, seeing how Anna naturally stepped into a supportive role with Grace's medical care, observing the obvious love and stability in our household, he understood that love really did multiply rather than divide. He admitted that his anger had been based on fear rather than any real moral principle. He'd been terrified of losing his position as my only child, afraid that my love for new people would somehow diminish what I felt for him. But seeing the way I interacted with Emma and James, the obvious pride and affection I felt for them, he realized that my capacity for love hadn't decreased, but had simply expanded to include more people who deserved care and attention. Over the following weeks, our blended family came together in ways that exceeded my most optimistic hopes. Anna, with her nursing background and professional experience, was able to help Sarah understand Grace's treatment plan and potential side effects. She explained medical terminology in plain language, helped them navigate insurance complications, and provided the kind of practical support that comes from both clinical knowledge and personal compassion. Emma and James visited Grace regularly, bringing artwork and games, and most importantly, the normal childhood energy that Grace desperately needed during her treatments. They treated her illness as something serious but not insurmountable, offering distraction and companionship without the heavy emotional weight that adult visitors sometimes brought to her bedside. Tyler, who had been struggling with fear and anger about his sister's illness, found comfort in having James to talk to about difficult feelings and confusing medical procedures. James, being slightly older and naturally thoughtful, became a steady presence for Tyler during the scariest moments of Grace's treatment. They developed the kind of easy friendship that often springs up between children who share significant experiences, supporting each other through fear and uncertainty. Michael and Sarah started coming to our house for regular family dinners, tentatively at first, but with growing comfort and enthusiasm as they saw how seamlessly the children interacted and how genuinely Anna cared about Grace's recovery. Gradually, Michael began to see Anna not as a replacement for his mother, but as a person in her own right. Someone who had brought joy and stability back into my life while adding her own unique strengths to our family dynamic. He watched her care for Grace with both professional skill and genuine maternal affection. He saw how she supported Sarah through the emotional roller coaster of having a seriously ill child, offering both practical help and emotional understanding. He witnessed the way she'd raised Emma and James to be kind, empathetic children, despite their own difficult start in life. And he began to understand that her character had been tested and proven long before she'd met me. One evening, after Grace had been declared in remission and was finally home from the hospital, Michael stayed after dinner to help me repair a section of fence in the backyard that had been damaged by winter storms. As we worked together in comfortable silence, sharing tools and coordinating our efforts with the easy rhythm of people who'd done such projects together many times before, he suddenly stopped and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. He said he owed Anna a much better apology than the emotional one he'd given during that first visit to the hospital. He wanted to acknowledge not just the cruel things he'd said about her, but the time he'd stolen from our family by being stubborn and prideful. He'd spent 2 years punishing all of us for his inability to accept change, and he was deeply ashamed of the pain he'd caused. More than that, he said, watching Anna care for Grace during her illness, seeing how she'd helped Sarah through the crisis, and witnessing the way Emma and James had embraced Tyler and Grace without question or reservation had shown him what family really meant. It wasn't about protecting some idealized version of the past, but about creating space for love to grow and including people who brought joy and strength to the group.